Folks, welcome to PRT. My name is Josh Turner, also known as Wolf. PRT stands for Paranormal Round Table. And my co-host, he's not important, so I'm not even going to mention his name. That's Wolfman 80. What?
Paranormal Round Table? I thought this was Pretty Righteous Time.
No, dude. Yeah. Well, no, not anymore.
Am I on the wrong show?
It was until you showed up. It was Pretty Righteous
man.
Time that you showed up and started messing with it.
All
right, folks. He's here. Go ahead. Mushu.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, okay. Whatever.
Okay.
Lackluster introduction, but as you were saying.
Oh, it's a lackluster introduction to a lackluster person.
Hey, man. I do a lot.
I have you know that I have luster. Okay. Anyways, guys, we're just messing around here. DasWolfman88@gmail.com. DasWolfman88@gmail.com. Send us your stories. Send us your crazy stories, your outlandish stories, UFOs, Bigfoot, whatever you want to throw out.
Love to hear it.
Love to hear it. Ghosts, nothing's too weird, man. Just let me know, and I'll read it, and I'll be like, "Ooh, I'm gonna put that on the air." Just kidding. I'll read it, and if it's show worthy, if not, if you just want to talk, I talk to people all the time about their experiences. Some people tell me stories, and they're not really wanting me to tell them on the air, but I'll still listen. I try to make time because me personally, I like to hear crazy stories, spooky stories. It's just a passion of mine, listening to people's fear. No, I'm just kidding. That sounds like it over here. So anyways, folks, before we go any further, I wanted to give the email.
You're going to give the email. It's PRT Podcast PRTpodcast.com is the website where you can find our merch store, our PayPal, all our previous episodes. We have a little section for artwork. We have a lot of stuff on there. We'd appreciate it if you check it out.
Okay. Well, that's actually not what I was going to say. I was going to give the email again, but that's fine.
Oh, well, I stood up for myself.
All right,
again.
Fine, Tony. You want me to admit it, folks? Yes, I was wrong. I said email, and I should have said the whatever, Tony.
We're leaving that in. I'm not cutting it.
You're correct. I know you will because you're a jerk. You're correct. I made a mistake, and I said email again. I was trying to cover it up, and I lied, folks, and I'm sorry. I apologize. Tony was correct, and he was trying to give you the website.
This sinner over here. Anyway. But there's also, if you need to find a link to our website or our PayPal or our merch store, it's also in the link of the YouTube description. We have them on every episode, so it's not just anything recent coming out. We have Anthony's kept up with it and make sure they're on almost all of them. We'd appreciate it if you check it out. It means a lot to us. Yep.
Also, please like our Josh Turner. It's a fan page. It's on Facebook. If you like, if you can go and like that. I invited a lot of people to like it because I need validation as a person. I'm just kidding, folks. Seriously, I need to do that because we're promoting for the show. And then the Paranormal Round Table page, where we need people to like that page too. Also, if you would join Paranormal Round Table, the group. Now, the benefit to joining Paranormal Round Table, the group, is very minimal. You're just there. No, I'm just kidding. It's actually pretty cool. If you join, when the show airs, okay, we'll put the link on Paranormal Roundtable, the group, on Facebook. And through that, you will put the comments on there, and someone will pick a winner for a prize. And that will happen every week of every show. Will happen every show. This week will be David Weatherly. Obviously, he's our guest tonight. And we'll be giving away one of his autographed books. So, and I really enjoyed the book that we're going to be discussing tonight. It's really good. So if you guys would be so kind as to go and leave a comment on there. If you want one to stand out, Zane's going to be the judge this week. If you want one to stand out to him, then I would say, hey, leave a comment and catch his eye with it. And there you go.
Exactly. And there's also the other groups that we manage, Paranormal Lounge, Paranormal Encounters. We'd appreciate it if you would join those too. Yeah, and also we got Michael Moran. He runs a really good group too. That we're all Squad.
It's no longer the Cryptid Squad. He fixed that. It's Cryptid Squad. And then we got Lori Shivers from Cryptids and Paranormal Reality. Okay, now, there's a couple of Dogman groups that I'm involved into. Bigfoot and Dogman Info Library. That's a pretty good one. Dogman Werewolf Discussion. There's a lot of them. I mean, I can't even name them all. There's so many groups that I'm in. The True Horror Stories of Texas. I like that one. You got Michigan Dogman Only, Canine Cryptids, Friends and Readers of Phantoms and Monsters. That's Lon Strickler. That's a pretty good one. So, yeah, just going down the list here. Dogman Believers Only. I like that group. It's all run by good people. Go in and join those groups, and we can all share information and talk and just be friends. So, with all that being said, we're going to get right to the show. We're going to interview David Weatherly. So, David, tell us a little bit about yourself to get started here.
Well, sure. I got interested in strange things, so to speak, when I was a kid, and grew up in the rural South. I was born in the 60s, so by the 1970s, when I was really fascinated with this stuff, it was not hip, wasn't part of pop culture, so I grew up with a very unusual interest at the time, and it was kind of across the board, from haunted sites to cryptids to UFOs and anything weird and strange. I was interested in it. And by the time I was a teenager, I started actively investigating. Never looked back, quite honestly. I've been exploring ever since then. So I've been delving into this stuff since the 1970s, and I've traveled all over the world. Been very blessed to be able to pursue this passion of mine and turn it into a career.
Now, you've been all over the world, but your favorite place is Texas, right?
Oh, you're right about that.
That's awesome. So David is a prodigal son. He's returned to us. You can't have him. He belongs to us now. He's one of the Borg. That's it. So, David, okay, so first of all, I wanted to say something. David is a prolific author. Okay, people use that term all the time, but he really is. 23 books, David?
There's about 25 total. Some of the early stuff is out of print, but I think there's somewhere between around 15 or 16 that are currently in print. You can find those on my website and on Amazon.
Yeah, and
the latest one came out January. It was a Strange Intruders, I believe.
No, Strange Intruders is an old one.
No. You're wrong, sir. Alaska. Yeah. Creatures. What is it called? It's called Creatures from the Last Frontier.
Monsters
from the Last Frontier. Yep.
Yep. And the subtitle is Cryptids and Legends of Alaska.
Yep. And that book is awesome. Folks, we're going to be giving away an autographed copy of his book during the show on this show today. So what you're going to do is, when we put the link onto the show onto our Facebook group, Paranormal Round Table, you just go on there and you leave a comment, and we'll choose a winner, just like we did last week. This week's judge will be Zane. We'll be choosing another, and you could win an autographed copy of David Weatherly's book. The book, okay, man, there's so much to that book. Alaska's a big place, and I don't even know where to begin. There were so many crazy things in the book, folks. A giant beaver destroys a town. That was crazy. Okay, that, and then there was a 6-foot platypus. Now, in the book, I was sitting there going like, wait a minute, platypuses are not native to North America at all. Now, they are marsupials, right? And they're from Australia.
That was kind of a one-off sighting that was detailed, collected by Bobby Short.
Yeah.
And, the series, so just so people are clear, this book, there's actually sort of a series that's been running on state cryptids. The first one I did was on Nevada. It's called Silver State Monsters. And then I did Arizona, which was Copper State Monsters. You probably see a theme here using the state nicknames. And then the latest one, of course, is Monsters of the Last Frontier, is on Alaska. And really my goal with the series was to sort of go old style, like a bestiary or an old cryptozoology book. I really wanted people to feel like they were picking something up that, had some depth to it, rather than just a cursory overview of hey, this is going on there. So I dug into, of course, I cover a lot of recent sightings at the time of the writing, but I also dig into folklore. I dig into native traditions, and that's always been kind of my route to investigate things and research anyway. I like to actually go to the locations. I've been to every state, so I've been able to investigate sightings and encounters in every state. And when I really started digging into the files and realized, wow, there's a lot of stuff here, Alaska, of course, was a little bit more challenging than the first two because there are so many sightings. I mean, Sasquatch encounters alone in Alaska would take up, probably 2 or 3 volumes. So that part I certainly do give sort of an overview and hit the high points, so to speak. But there's other things that just a lot of people aren't aware of or they don't completely understand. And those things I try to incorporate in the book also. We get this weird one-off sighting of a platypus in Alaska, which is completely bizarre. We get stories of the Kushtaka, which is a giant bipedal otter man. And that, incidentally, is what's on the cover. These covers are done by my artist. His name is Sam Sharon. He just does an amazing job. And I think I challenge him each time because I typically for this series will pick one of the more unusual cryptids or the cryptid that's maybe most associated with the state other than Sasquatch and have him put that on the cover. And when I threw this at him, I said, all right, Sam, this is the Kushtaka is a giant bipedal otter person. And,
so he was like, what am I going to draw?
He was like, okay, I'll have to think about this one. But man, he really comes through, because he, of course, on the surface, I mean, that sounds so absurd, right? A bipedal otter person. I haven't seen very many artistic depictions of the Kushtaka. So, it's kind of right on the line where this could look really hokey or ridiculous, or just too whatever. But man, he really captures it. That piece of artwork alone, I think, is worth the price of the book. And I obviously am biased, but anyway, the Kushtaka is covered in the book.
A good book, I tell you right now.
I can tell. Did he also do the cover for Strange Intruders? Because that's kind of what hooked me, and that's probably why I got confused. Because I had a question about that.
Yeah, he did that cover too.
Yeah, that cover stood out to me as I was going over your books. Just the Slenderman on it and all these other cryptids and a weird a amalgamation of horror basically. And that's why I got confused.
Pretty good artwork on there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the concept for that, I came up with this idea that the book Strange Intruders obviously is a collection of different weird encounters that people have had. And there's a theory that some of these things come from another dimension or, another level of existence. And when I was writing the book, my concept for the cover was to show a bunch of these figures coming through a glass or a mirror or something, and sort of breaking through. So that's exactly what Sam did. I gave him the figures that I wanted on it and that basic concept. And that's what he came up with. And yeah, it was a beautiful job. That was the first piece of work he did for me. The first artwork.
I can see why you kept him. I mean, it was.
And it was really interesting because Sam, he was in the UK at the time. He's a Brit. And he actually emailed me and he said, I love your work. I listen to you on the various shows and everything all the time. And if you ever need a cover, and it was the middle of the night. I was sitting here working on Strange Intruders when this popped up. And I remember looking at his artwork, which was, some of it was kind of industrial and it was, just different stuff. Didn't have anything really had a concept of, but I was like, I don't know. I kind of got a good feeling about this guy. So I threw this idea at him and you see what he came up with. It was mind boggling.
Well, keep him on the payroll for sure.
Oh yeah,
he's got some good, and I think he did a good job with the Kushtaka. Now, folks, those of you listening at home, let me tell you something. It sounds silly, the Kushtaka, the whole thing behind it, but it's not. Okay, these creatures, and David touches in depth in his book. I think he probably talk about them more than you do them in Bigfoot, pretty much more than any other of the cryptids, because it is a very integral part of the traditions of the First Nations peoples up there, and they believe in it full force. I mean, it's not like something that they take lightly, and it's not something they like to be picked at or made fun of for, because it's just like any natives, they're going to hold to their traditions and their beliefs, and the Kushtaka play a very big part of that. They're very menacing beings, and they are sort of a creature that walks between two worlds, sort of a spiritual, ethereal being, but it can manifest itself as a physical being, and they can do real physical harm. And of course, I'm not going to get into a whole spiel about what they are. The book tells you in depth pretty much what they are and their traditions and their beliefs, but they are a creature that's not to be messed with and are taken lightly. And a lot of the weird creatures that were in your book, another one that I thought was interesting was the if I could say this correctly, the Gona Cadet, part wolf, part orca.
Right.
That's crazy. Like, because the orcas are known as the wolves of the sea, but a part wolf, part orca, those are my two favorite animals. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, that's awesome. You know, like that was
well, it sounds awesome until you meet it.
I wouldn't want to be swimming around the water and see this thing coming, but you know, obviously. And then you talk about the Port Chatham. Now I wanted to touch on that a little bit. Now you go in, you talk a little more in depth in that too in the book. Port Chatham. I mean, that's something that's always fascinated me. Basically, I mean, it was a settlement that ended up having to be abandoned. You want to talk about that briefly, Dave?
It was. It's a really intriguing story. This is it's a small little place. It's on the Kenai Peninsula, and it's a town that's also known as Portlock. So you know, it was originally a little cannery town in the early 20th century, and we're talking the 1920s. There were you know, was when it was kind of a town that was on the map because it had a post office that opened. But really, you know, this place never grew very big. By 1940, it had, I think, 30 residents at kind of its peak. But here's the weird thing that happened with this place. The stories say that suddenly everyone left the town. And there's a little bit of dispute about exactly what happened or how it happened. You know, the town never really grew to many people, so you know, mostly we're talking about just probably a handful of families that lived there. But the mystery surrounding the town really starts in the 1930s because there was a man who was a logger, and he was using a piece of machinery, logging equipment, in the woods just outside of the town, and he was killed. Now, the legend says that he was killed by the piece of logging equipment, which is simply too big for any human to move themselves. And as the stories grew, there were other things that were talked about involving this town. Purportedly, there were these large hairy creatures lurking outside in the woods around the town. And hunters would go up, they would find massive tracks. Hunters would go and disappear in the woods around the town. Now, we are talking about a remote area of Alaska. It's very difficult to access. Port Chatham is. I know I haven't been there myself, unfortunately. I tried to get there the last time I was in Alaska, but as I said, it's a very difficult location to get to. I have talked to a number of people who've been there themselves, and you know, it's even to this day, it's a very mysterious place. But what's interesting was that in the 1970s, there was an article that ran in the Anchorage Daily News, and it was talking about the town and about the fact that during World War II there were these rumors of these creatures around the town, and that they even interviewed an elder who had grown up in the town, and she was born in Port Chatham, but talks about the fact that her family, they all left their houses and they just abandoned their homes and their school and everything. And she said that it was because of the Nantinnuk, which is essentially a hairy man. And it's pretty amazing. I mean, this was, you know, mainstream news. I think it was, I remember correctly, it was one of the area magazines out of Anchorage again, might have been the Homer Tribune, actually, newspaper, interviewed this woman and told this story. And she recalled being a child and going to school in Port Chatham and everything else, and suddenly being told were moving and all the villagers leaving because of the Nantinnuk and the fact that it was killing people and basically terrorized this little town.
That is crazy. When I first heard about this place, I mean, of course I was young when I first read about it, and it was just like something brief. And I can't remember where I read it. It might have been Fate magazine or so. I was always reading so many books growing up. But I read about it and I thought, what a horrifying experience. You said, now you couldn't make it over there, David. That's because God loves you and didn't want you there. He's like, you're not going to get there. That's just the bottom line. And now he said in the book that you can't access it by an ATV even. Like they said, well, you can get there by ATV, but you can't. Well, that's probably a good thing because that is probably the home of these creatures and they don't want anybody there. And not to be confused with the Kushtaka, because now the First Nations are very specific about the hairy man or the big man is not the Kushtaka. The Kushtaka are a shape-shifting type of otter-type beings, very, hairy and just kind of, I guess, resemble an otter.
Yeah, well, that's something I try to make very clear in the book because in recent years, especially, a lot of Sasquatch researchers have defaulted to this idea that the Kushtaka is a Sasquatch. And, I've talked to natives in Alaska, and they are very adamant that it is not the same thing. And in fact, the tribes that talk about the Kushtaka, it's very clear to me just at a brief glance because they have specific names for the hairy man. There's a lot of different names for Sasquatch in Alaska because there are a lot of tribes there, and they each have their own identifier. But they are very clear with the fact that it is not, that a Kushtaka is not hairy man. That's not what they're talking about. And it was probably, Kushtaka was probably one of the most challenging things that I've written about in some time because I really try my best to be respectful to native traditions. I always, talk to native people and try to get their input when I can. And, I try to be very respectful to their traditions and at the same time convey it, to the Western mind in a way that makes sense because we're talking about a completely different cultural viewpoint and concept. And sometimes it's important for people to remember that when they're reading about these things, that they need to step outside of their zone of comfort or what's normal for them and understand that, okay, it may sound absurd to you that we're talking about a 6-foot-tall otter, but you have to understand the concepts and the worldview that came from and why and how that developed. And, that alone will help you make sense of it to a degree, but it is a very complex thing to wrap your head around. And the Kushtaka stories are interwoven with the beliefs and the spirituality and everything else of the people, as well as the environment, because it's very much a product of a place that to some degree is otherworldly. Alaska, Josh, you and I were talking about this earlier off air, it has this very compelling yet otherworldly quality. It's a very unique place, and you feel it when you go there to visit. So, the people who have lived there for generations have developed these different views and concepts that are partially from their tribal beliefs, but partially from the environment. So the otter, seems an odd choice to some degree, but at the same time, you have to understand that on a basic level, otters are seen as unusual there anyway because they can live in the water and they can live on land. So they're sort of creatures of two worlds just from that view. And when you add the other complexities and the simple understanding of otters, they're very family oriented, they're very intelligent, and all of these things contributed to the overall tapestry of the Kushtaka itself. And it is indeed, as you stated, a shapeshifter. The idea is that a human can become a Kushtaka. And I'll just kind of leave it at that because that too is a very complex topic, how that happens.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And you go in depth about it. The funny thing, one of the funny things you said in the book was you called the otters industrious. And I thought that was pretty cool because otters are family oriented, they're cute, and they're industrious. But if you took one and stretched it out to the size of a man, and he was evil and had evil intentions, it would terrify you. Because that would be scary. If I walked outside right now to go to my truck and I saw a 6-foot-tall otter thing coming toward me, I would probably do something really bad in my pants.
Otter, I mean, if I went outside and I saw a 6-foot-tall cute little bunny, I'd be like, whoa.
It just doesn't matter. If it's 6 foot tall and it's shaped like a man, it's going to be kind of, it's going to scare you. So, yeah, but the otter can also be, they're carnivorous, and they can be vicious too by the same token. So, I mean, that leads me into my next question I was going to ask you, David. And this is just out of curiosity. The goat man. Now, here in Texas, we get stories of goat man, and you don't talk about that in the book because there's not a goat man running around in Alaska that anybody's seeing that we know of. But the otter man does a lot of the same things that the goat man does, as far as like the way it communicates and shapeshifts and pretends to be somebody else. I've gotten stories of the goat man doing and saying like somebody thinks that it's somebody that they know.
And mimicking.
Right.
Mimicking, yes.
Yes, and you find a lot of the same things with the Kushtaka stories in Alaska. Now, sometimes that's because maybe they are a relative who was lost in the wilderness or something, and they become a Kushtaka.
A Kushtaka, yeah, which is a horrible fate. It's like the natives live in fear of becoming one of these things. It's not an existence you want to have. One of the things I was going to point out, folks, is David, you're actually a very nice guy. And I don't just say that because you're on the show right now. I'm being honest, because there was a thread on Facebook where someone was kind of like correcting you and being very, what I thought was kind of condescending and saying, rude. Well, it's not necessarily rude, but correcting David and saying, "Oh, you're not saying it right. You're not pronouncing it or spelling it correctly." And David didn't respond and go, "Well, read the book and you'll know." Blah blah blah. But when I read that, I thought, "Oh, that's not very nice." But when I read the book, you clearly in the book you say that there are different pronunciations and different spellings depending on the First Nations people that Now, this person wasn't a First Nations person, but they claimed to be the authority on it. And David was just like, "Okay, well, that's fine." And you just let the water roll off your back. Where I would have been, "Why don't you read the book?" Because that's the kind of person I am. I'm not you. And I'm not, polite. So I said something to Ken about it. And Ken was like, "Well, David's such a nice guy. He's not going to say anything, And I was like, "Well, I guess I won't either," because I didn't want to start nothing, because I was going to say, "Why don't you read the book?" But David just kind of like, "Well, it's cool, whatever, But yeah, I guess I'll know one day.
You win an argument with someone like that. So, part of it is intelligence on my part, just saying, why waste the time and energy?
So David's calling me stupid, folks.
Really,
Well, I guess in that respect, I probably am, because I probably would have said something back and been like, on page 40, whatever, you read the book, like I probably would have said something. But the point is that you're a very nice guy and you're smart enough to avoid the conflict, and you didn't sit there and try to tell people, well, it's a good book if you read it, because that would have been my impulse. Right. But I guess that's why I'm not a great author, because I don't have that. But anyways.
I have cool people like you who support my work and go on air and say this is a great book. So,
well, there you go. I appreciate it. Yeah, it does. You and Ken and Lyle and Nick, you all live in Texas. I think that's awesome. Four of my favorite authors, Linda, and Lon round out my others, but I forgive them for not living in Texas, but
Well, you know who else is in Texas or original? The Expanded Perspective guys.
Oh, the guys up in Expanded Perspective, they do the show up in Fort Worth. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's a lot of us down here doing paranormal cryptid stuff, and it's not just a bunch of cows down here. We're doing other stuff too. Slowly but surely, we got electricity and running water last week, so we'll see what happens.
Finally got off my horse and I bought a Tesla.
These newfangled flying machines up and down the skies. But another one I wanted to touch on about the book, and this is pretty cool. You talked about this creature that was a walrus dog, which was kind of odd. Now, I had a story that I talked about on my show, I believe, or it might have been on Vic's show. I don't know. I can't remember. I talked about it. It was a buddy of mine. Now, he's got a funny nickname. We call him Starscream, and there's a reason for that. It's from the Transformers cartoon, but anyways, when he worked for me, he always wanted to be the boss, and so we started calling him that. Now his nickname is just Scream. We call him Scream, but he lives up in Fort Worth too, or up in Dallas. And he was down on the coast a few years ago, and he came down for my birthday, and so he was telling my wife a crazy story. When he was visiting, I think he said he was down in Padre Island, South Padre Island. This thing, he saw this weird looking thing that had legs like a dog. I mean, it was dark. He said it was dark, and he was on the beach, and him and his girlfriend, this thing, were watching, and this thing came out onto the land and was kind of rooting around and sniffing on the beach. And he's like, dude, it wasn't a seal, but it had legs like almost like a dog, but real short, stubby legs. Now, Tony, I know you remember this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he told that story, and I thought, Scream, you're drunk. And he goes, no. He goes,
he was very adamant.
He goes, I know what I saw. He goes, and this thing was black. And I said, well, it was dark. He goes, well, I shined a light at it. And he goes, and it was the weirdest looking thing. It almost looked like a dog, but it had like no fur. Like it was sleek. And then he said that it turned and ran back into the water and disappeared. And he said that if he had to put a finger on it, it was like a cross between a reptile and a dog. And when I read your book and I read The Walrus Dog, my wife was like, honey, look at this, because she was going over it, whatever. And I hadn't started reading it at that point, actually. And she was telling me there's some pretty cool stuff in it. She was kind of skimming through it. And I said, well, I need to read it then, And so when I got to that part, I thought that's really weird because there's even a drawing. Like you have drawings throughout the book. Like, at the beginning of a lot of the chapters, there's drawings. But yeah.
Those are actually vintage illustrations that get put in that, it's amazing what, some of these really antique illustrations that were done sometimes in reflection of native stories and things like that, and you're talking about dog legends. There's some really curious things that come up in Alaska with canids, because there's the Kilut, which is said to be it's an evil spirit that takes the form of a black dog, but it's almost completely hairless. And the curious thing about it is that it's said that its tracks automatically vanish. So it prowls around, it'll stalk travelers, but it can never be tracked because the tracks won't stay down. There's another one that is, the Adlet, which is sort of, I first heard of it, somebody told me it was a werewolf, but when I really dug in and found out about the legends, it's not at all. It's actually a creature that is human on the upper part of the body, but from the waist down is a dog.
Ooh.
So it's sort of it gets into the range of a satyr or something almost, but it's canid instead. And one of the most interesting things I found about dogs in Alaska was that they are one of the things that purportedly protects people from the Kushtaka.
That was something I wanted to touch on with you too. I was reading a book not too long ago, and if anybody wants to read it, it's called Legends of the Fire Spirits. It's a pretty good book, but I've heard this before. I worked with Arabs and Persians and a lot of different people, Kurds, over the years. I've been around a lot of different types of ethnic people from the Middle East, Mediterranean area. Very similar. One of my buddies is actually Turkish. He runs a hotel here in Austin. And one of the things that we were talking about was there was a jinn legend. And it was about one called the Nazgul or Gula or Guela, depending on which region you're from. Now, these things, the legends of the Guela, Nogula, whatever, they go all the way from like Tunisia, North Africa, all the way to like Syria. And so, they're all the same. They're kind of like a ghoul. It's a jinn. It's with their version of like a demon in the Middle East, and they travel in the desert and they look for victims and they eat people is what they are. They're people eaters. But one of the things that the Nagula is afraid of is a wolf. They're terrified of wolves, and supposedly there is a type of wolf that hunts them specifically, depending on what region you talk to somebody about. a friend of mine from Lebanon told me that the story that they have is this wolf actually eats the ghoul, and they're mortal enemies, and it's the only thing that the ghoul this jinn is afraid of. But the legend is that this wolf, it's a specific type of wolf, and the wolf itself can also be a shapeshifter. And some of the legends talk about these wolves running around like a man. They don't actually say they walk on two legs. They just say that they move about as a man, which makes you wonder, is it a man pretending, like, is it a shapeshifter? So it gets really kind of weird. And when I was reading that part of the book, I thought, oh, that's crazy, because that's a thread. That's one that I've picked up, and I was recommended by a friend of mine that's Persian to read that book, Legends of the Fire Spirit. So it is a good book, David, if you ever want to check it out. It's got the guy that wrote it, like, he did a very good job of...
I've read it.
Oh, I'm sure you have. Yeah, there you go. Simpsons did it, but anyway.
It's a great book. I've delved pretty extensively into the Jinn stuff, and in fact, there's a chapter on them in Strange Intruders.
Yeah, and I haven't read Strange Intruders. That's one of them I hadn't read. So, but definitely looking forward to reading that one too. But I did read Black Eyed Kids, and that one was an awesome book too. We'll get into that in a little bit, folks. So anyway, that was another question I had. So you know all about that, and folks at home, I just was throwing that out there. Obviously, David, you know what a dogman is. A lot of people don't, because the term is, it hasn't been around a long time. I mean, I guess it has, but not in the mainstream as it is now. But what about legends of dogman in Alaska, or just in general? What is your thought on this particular cryptid?
Yeah, you don't really find that in Alaska. Obviously a lot of water-based cryptids, because there's so much water in Alaska, so many bodies of fresh water, plus the ocean, of course, borders a good portion of the state. But other than the few canine legends we addressed, there's really not a whole lot like that in Alaska. Now, dogman itself is pretty intriguing. This term, as you said, is not that old, really. And I'm not sure. I tried to figure out at one point, I think it might have been Ken and I talking about this, the origin of this dogman phrase. And because I know a lot of people use it now to sort of distinguish and get away from the term werewolf, which, so many people now associate with the movies, right? You say werewolf, and what's the first thing people think of? It's
the Howling,
or Lon Chaney, or American Werewolf in London, whatever. But really, werewolf lore, something I find very, very fascinating. And there's a lot of werewolf lore in early America that I've been collecting over the last few years, that just forgotten pieces from here and there, that were people who immigrated here in the early days of settlement, and they brought their traditions, whether they came from France or Germany or wherever, and they were seeing these creatures, and they identified them as werewolves. So some of these tidbits are just fascinating. One of my favorites is there was a incident. I put this on the website. There's an article on it, if somebody's interested in reading it. But essentially, there was a point in Pennsylvania when timber carts were being plagued by werewolves. They were being attacked, and the Pennsylvania Dutch who were running the carts painted hex signs on the wheels to try to deter these wolf creatures from attacking the timber wagons coming down the mountain. So, I think that this dogman stuff, it's one of those things that, to a certain degree, you just don't know what to think of as an investigator, because at this point, there are enough of these cases to make it really, really intriguing. And at the same time, you have to examine, why so many now, why the gaps in time where we had so many. Because the last few years, dozens, hundreds of these things have cropped up around the country, whereas previous years we just really didn't have that. How many do you find from the 70s or whatever, the 60s? a few here and there that are sporadic, and those are interesting too. So there's a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions about the Dogman. I think that sometimes it's people seeing maybe a Sasquatch or something like that. Obviously, on other occasions, it very clearly has canid features. When they have pointy ears that are sticking up and a long snout, then that's a whole different question. It's obviously not a Sasquatch. So I don't know. I think I'm intrigued by all of this stuff. So I find the accounts really fascinating.
Do you have any theories on why there's not a lot of accounts in Alaska, or do you have any have you found or just any theories?
Well, as far as Alaska goes, I mean, part of it possibly because of the climate. Even though these things are found in cold climates, because a lot of sightings obviously from Wisconsin and Michigan and areas like that. Alaska is very unique. It's a very different climate, and maybe they are up there. There's so much wilderness in Alaska that it wouldn't surprise me for a whole range of creatures that we're not aware of to actually be living up there. But if we really look at werewolf lore in general, then it seems to be, werewolf / dogman, then it really seems to be much more connected to human civilization somehow, particularly Western civilization. So when you factor in that a lot of Alaska is still native residents, then maybe they just haven't immigrated there, so to speak, at this point, at least in any significance that people are reporting them, or even comfortable reporting them. But it's really fascinating to look at shapeshifter legends in general around the world, and you see that there are regional connections to how these things are portrayed or how they're perceived. So we go to the Southwest. Something else I've looked at extensively is a skinwalker, and the skinwalkers tend to be, coyote, or they can take other forms. But when you look at their transformations, it's very connected to the native peoples of the region. We go to Alaska. Obviously, we already talked about the Kushtaka, and they've connected it to the otter. So werewolf lore, a lot of that comes out of Europe originally. Areas like France and Germany, wolves were a very terrifying thing at one point in human civilization. So, it's kind of, to a degree, I guess, represents the wild, the untamed, the unknown to a degree. And these shape-shifting legends seem to blend in very deftly with those human concerns and human concepts. So we certainly have to consider that and how it melds into the folklore of the people and how they translate and perceive what's happening. Doesn't mean these things aren't real to some degree, but I think the door is wide open as to exactly what they can be, because that and I know I'm kind of going down the rabbit hole here, but we have to start looking at concepts of tulpas and other manifestations and consider how much are we co-creating some of these things into existence.
That's awesome that you touched on that, because that is one of my theories. I believe that tulpa is a very yeah, that's I don't know how, man, that is the rabbit hole, like you said. I have a theory about that.
The Slenderman chapter in Strange Intruders, people ask me why I put Slenderman in that book, because the other creatures that are in the book, they're physical manifestations that people are seeing. And the creepy thing is that Slenderman is too at this point. And it's interesting because I was doing a lecture tour on tulpas the year that the Wisconsin case happened with the two girls who tried to murder their classmate. And for a year prior to that, I'd done a lecture tour about tulpas. And one of the things I warned people about was the Slenderman. And I said, look, this is something that obviously we know the origins of the Slenderman. It began as part of an internet contest. But the thing is that when they launched that contest, their idea was to create something that people would believe was real. If you go back and it's very tedious, but when I wrote that piece on the Slenderman, I went back and read that entire thread, which is, oh my God, I don't know how many entries. But the concept was, let's create a paranormal themed image that we can make go viral on the internet that people will believe is real. So they did that. And it's really fascinating to read through, and you'll see that the Slenderman took over the thread, the idea of it. Other people contributed. And eventually what happened was people independent who had no idea about that thread started independently reporting encounters with what they described as the Slenderman figure. So, I think that was a very interesting experiment in a way, but I think it is a manifestation. It's a tulpa that was created through the collective consciousness, because for the first time, something like that was sent out utilizing social media, immediately around the world through whatever, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. People became aware to some degree of the Slenderman, and it became implanted in people's consciousness. And what does that do, when thousands upon thousands of people believe this thing is out there?
Yeah, there was an experiment that was done. Now, you said the first time in social media, but there was an experiment that was done in a college. Do you want to expound on that? And I'm asking you to expound on it because I don't know the name of the college, and I can't remember when it happened.
Are you talking about the Philip experiment?
There you go. It's Philip.
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm sitting here going
that was pre-social media, but that was actually developed out of spiritualist concepts, and the idea was done by a group in Canada, and their idea was to create a historical figure that wasn't real, but to give him a backstory, to give him to put details of his life in there, and to proceed to try to communicate with him. So they, considering that we're talking about spiritualism, at the time the method was, table tapping and these types of different things, Ouija boards and so forth. So they developed this character. They put some historical inaccuracies in intentionally, so that they could distinguish whether they were getting Philip or some other spirit, that was coming in trying, possibly with the same name or something. And they went through a series of experiments where they finally began receiving communication from Philip. Now, it took a strange turn because the spirit, Philip, began to tell them things about themselves that no one else in the group knew. So he was revealing secrets. And, it really was an experiment essentially to create a tulpa, although they only carried it so far. They stopped. But by the time they got into the late phases of this experiment, they were having things like the table levitating and other weird manifestations. And, it was, by all accounts, very successful. But again, a fabricated entity that somehow became real to a certain degree.
That is what's scary, is that, they started out making this, whatever, make-believe, and it turned into something real.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of, tulpas and, the Slenderman and things like creepypasta, one of our cryptids that we do cover quite a few times on the show is a Rake, which is also founded on creepypasta. It started.
Well, we don't know what it is.
Well, I mean, the name Rake started on.
We get descriptions.
But the actual creature itself is just very bizarre. It's like this transparent, sometimes like milky white or transparent, very skinny, creepy looking. Walks like weird on either like a crab or has its like joints mess around.
Yeah, it can move itself in different ways.
I was just wondering what you thought about that. And do you think it's a similar thing to the Slenderman, where enough people believed in it that other people started to see it,
thinking it up?
Yeah,
I think so. And there's always this case, especially with modern social media, where people, unfortunately, the attention span is so short amongst many people now, and particularly the younger generation. So,
Yeah.
if it's not in 120 characters or less, they might not know about it. And, many of these people, they just hear something, they hear an idea, they hear, oh, my friend's friend saw the rake, oh, that thing's so creepy. And, there's this automatic assumption that this thing is real, that there's something like this out there. And yeah, who knows? I think that, again, with the modern ability to communicate around the world, we've got different things to consider in terms of our collective consciousness and how we are co-creating these things into existence. And, to a degree, this is not new. We were talking about the jinn earlier, and you have to consider that a lot of people don't realize that the Muslim faith, the Islamic faith states that one of the tenets is that anything that's written in the holy books must be believed. Well, the holy books talk about the jinn. Therefore, if you're a good Muslim, then you believe in the jinn. Now, there are different degrees of that. I know Muslims, and the greater percentage of them won't talk about the jinn because it's viewed as bad luck to even say the name. You'll clear the room usually of any people of that faith. But at the same time, there's a certain percentage of them who say, well, yes, we do believe in them, but they're spiritual beings. We don't have to worry about. They're at a different their level of existence, so we don't have to worry about them. But my point there, as opposed to rambling, my point is that how many Muslims are in the world now? It's the fastest growing religion in the world, and bear in mind that every one of them, to some degree or other, believes in the existence of the jinn.
Yeah, and you're right about that. A lot of them won't talk about it, but they believe that, and it's not a Muslim belief per se. It is a regional belief that, and the Arabs, when they were on their conquest, they spread Islam, like from North Africa all the way to China. And so, that's how everyone became Muslim, and their beliefs, they're all kind of intertwined, and it goes from those regions. That's the belief in those creatures or whatever, those entities, and that's how it spread to be Islamic. But it's not necessarily an Islamic belief; it predates it. Even the Zoroastrians, they believed in these creatures. Now they explain it in Islam a little differently. Of course, there was this figure that was, he was one, and he didn't bow down, Iblis. He didn't bow down to man, and that's their.
Well, that's right. The Muslims actually identify them as jinn, and that's where the tradition, that's where that aspect of the tradition comes from, and how it became a part of their belief systems. And there's some correlations. You can see some similarities between that and the Christian idea of fallen angels, but there really is there are some major differences. And as you started to say, I know I interrupted you, but as you started to say, the original belief amongst the Islamic faith is that the jinn refused to bow down to the superiority of man. So Allah basically exiled them. But it's really tricky when you start reading those early texts. I've been through a lot of that stuff, and they're banished, but not really. So they're here, but they just don't exist on the same level that we do. And that gets really fascinating because we're talking about an early concept of other dimensional existence. So, it really sounds like, okay, they're banished from this earthly plane, but they're still here amongst us.
Yeah, they live in an intermediate place. And
exactly.
Yeah, and they're supposedly in between us and the realm of angels. Well, right. And it's supposedly a right angle from a right angle or something, and it's the fourth dimension. I know it talks about the Green Mountains and how it's called the calf or the cough or cough, whatever. And I know that it talks about how they actually have neighbors, but it never really postulates on what those. It doesn't expound upon what those neighbors are. You can postulate all day long on what they are, but it's it's weird. It talks about them having neighbors, and I've often wondered if some of these what people would call like the Nephilim, maybe that was their neighbors, because I know that there were rebellious angels, and we're getting all into this biblical stuff here, whether you believe it or not. I mean, it's the belief, the stories are that there were these rebellious angels, but then there were also a group of watchers, 200 watchers called,
That's right.
And they were the fallen angels, and they were the ones that were actually put upon the earth to watch for the bad guys that had rebelled, and to keep us safe. And instead, they did the opposite, and they kind of fell in with, we're gods, which I think is like Zeus and Thor and all that. That's where that comes from. And they interbred, and then of course there's all these like different creatures. Now, when I was reading your book about the Alaska thing, one of the things I found interesting was the idea of the god bear, the 10-legged bear, and you're sitting there reading that, and you're going like, okay, wow, that's kind of fantastical. Now, David never says this is the truth, this is a real bear that lived. No, you just put it out there that this is some of the beliefs that that the natives had. But when you think about it, if you look at it from a biblical perspective, or even a Quranic perspective, or however you want to say it, in any of these religions, you go back to the story of the Nephilim, and you can see that these angels fallen angels polluted everything. So there could be something that was like that if you go by that logic in the Book of Enoch. Now, me personally, I do believe that there is a lot of truth in the Book of Enoch, and I have had many arguments with many people, because I'm a student of religion and a student of history for sure. Tony knows I got a huge library of books, and I read a lot about people and culture, and it's just because I'm fascinated by everyone else's culture and belief and what they think, what they believe. I've been fortunate to work with a lot of people from around the world, and I've traveled too. I haven't been to all 50 states, not like David. I have not been to the original 13, except for Pennsylvania. I went to Pennsylvania as far up, and then there's 14 states up there I haven't been to, but everywhere else I've been, and I've spent some time in different places. And you meet a lot of different people, and when you travel, you meet different people. Went to Athens when I was a kid with my dad, and so my dad was one of those dads that was like, "Oh, you want to go and look at all this? Okay, bye. Here, get on the train." And so he was a very trust your kid. That's not gonna, makes you tough, I guess. So he just, I had a chaperone and that barely spoke English, and I got to go and check out all these crazy things and stuff. When I was a kid, it was fascinating to me. The first book I read, historical person, was Alexander the Great, and I started with him. It just kind of went all the way up to World War II, and over the years, that's been fascinating to me. And I think that if you learn history in particular, you will kind of get a sense of what's going on now. But the problem is, like you said, the attention span is so small that people don't have time for that. They don't want to mess with that. Well, they do, but they don't want to make time for it. Now, if you don't know history, you're not going to know what's going on now. You're not going to know how we got to this point where we're at right now. And I have mentioned that book many times to people, because I thought that they had a wealth of information about what we're talking about, the legends of the fire spirits. And you were the only one who has said, yeah, I've read that book. And that's cool. I think the other one I corresponded with at one point was Rosemary Ellen Guiley. Like, she had written a book about angels and demons. And of course,
Rosemary was a very good friend of mine.
Oh, man.
That was we were very close, and that was a big loss.
Man, I'll tell you what.
Last year.
She was a giant. I mean, it was, and her book, I talked about a very odd experience that happened to me, and one of her books was sitting on my coffee table, and it was a book that she wrote one about angels and one about demons, and it was like an encyclopedia of them, and had their names and everything, what they did and what they represented. Very, very informative, and she was she was amazing. I liked her as an author. Just a very good person, but it's sad. That part's really sad. But she was like, folks, if you go and you want to read about some of these things, like, she was a good author. And I know there was another book that I had read. I think she wrote, and I'm not 100%. I think it was about fairies. I want to say that was her, and that one was very informative too. And I think that what these things are, like the fairies, that they're in the region of like Great Britain and France. I think that each area has its own type of, I guess, what the Arabs would call jinn. The ones from their region where they're from, they call them the jinn, but these other ones in other regions, they're called fairies or fae, depending on what region you're in. And I think that each area has its own spirits that kind of like, that's where they're at. It's like on your body, you have germs, and it's like that's where they're at. And if something else comes, then it's like, this is my spot. And they don't like it, and so that's kind of what these things are. They inhabit certain areas. And so when you go into an area and it's like, oh, this place is haunted, this place is this place is that. Well, it probably is, and it's probably from these entities. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fallen and their offspring, because it says that they were cast out, and when the flood came and they were wiped out, that they ended up being evil spirits, and that they were going to be called evil spirits for all time. Now that doesn't mean that the rebellious angels aren't around, because they are too. One of the fascinating passages in the book of Job, when God talks to Lucifer and he asks him, "Where hast thou been?" It always gave me the creeps when he said, "I've been walking to and fro upon and within the earth." And I always thought he was walking around on the earth. Like, that really, even as a kid, I was just like, whoa, wait, what? Like, what was that? Like, so this dude was walking around on the earth and walking in the earth. And so I always used that kind of as a reason not to go into caves and stuff. And I was like a very weird child. I was precocious, but I was also weird. And I was just like, nah, man, that just made me think, like, okay, so the devil, literally, as we know of as the devil in the Christian religion, is Lucifer. He's the main devil, I guess. But it's like he was just walking around with earthly feet. I mean, it's terrifying when you think about it. But I mean, obviously, the Nephilim were born of human women. So if you believe, like I believe, that these things can manifest themselves from spiritual into physical, and they can interact with people in a physical way. And it's very scary. And then when you talk about them having children, which I'm going to do a show eventually, folks, about the Nephilim. Everybody's just clamoring for that. And I have somebody that's just researched the heck out of it. And she's pretty amazing. But yeah, I mean, it's crazy. You get into like what they did, how they polluted the earth with everything. You can imagine they bred with all these different animals and different things. Now, I've often wondered, and now you can expound on this, David, if you think this is worth it. But I've often wondered if them breeding with these was more of an animal husbandry. Like if maybe they took genes, because they had the technology, and they created like these goatmen, satyr type creatures. They created these wolf creatures. They created all these different and these chimeric kind of creatures that people are seeing, and the otter man, like you talk about in your book, in the Alaska book. Another thing, you talked about the battle between the tailmen and the natives.
Right.
Like, that is a theme that comes up over and over again. The Utes and the Cherokee have stories like that too, where they fought like red-haired giants and they burned them out in a cave. The same thing with the tailmen. I'm not going to get into the whole story, but it's like there were these men that had these long tails. And they were eventually, they got into a fight with the natives. And so, you start to wonder, like, these giants, these tailmen, like in the book, these different types of chimeric creatures, the goat man, all these different types of entities. Are they the Nephilim? Are they from the fallen? Is that what we're dealing with? Are they the remnants of it? Or are they the manifestations of their evil spirits turning physical, and then... are they using portals? I mean, what is your thought on that, David?
Well, there's kind of a whole lot of questions within that, within what you were talking about. But, first of all, yeah, this concept or these stories about these battles that Native people have had with giants, as they're often termed. It's very fascinating thing. Now, I've been in Lovelock Cave. There's a whole section in the Nevada book about the battle that the Utes had with the red-haired giants, and it's it's kind of chilling. I mean, I stood and listened to a native elder tell me that story himself personally. So, kind of hearing it directly from a source at the time was fascinating. And what's interesting about that story is that there's a similar tale in Idaho along the Snake River. I later found a story in Arizona, just a small snippet of natives down there having a similar fight with giants. And then, of course, when I was researching the Alaska book, I discovered this story about the tailmen. And it's really, the whole thing is just kind of mind-boggling to a certain degree. I was Dr. Jeff Meldrum and I were talking about this, and this idea that, is it a cultural memory? But if so, why is it so universal almost? I mean, we're talking about a tribe in Alaska that has a version of it, and a tribe in southern Arizona. I mean, you can't get much more extreme than that in terms of climate and lifestyle and everything else. So that in itself is pretty stunning. And you find a lot of these stories all over the world. Of course, there's a famous story of David's battle with Goliath. You find giant tales all over the place. And you equally do find stories of shapeshifters. You find stories of the wee folk, the little people, the gentry. They go by all different names. But in different regions of the world, different places around the world, you find these stories. Now, one of the things that's always really intrigued me is that I've taught to native tradition teachers all over the world and heard these stories of whatever the race was they're talking about, be it elves or gnomes or whatever. And, consistently you hear this idea that, yes, they were here, they were physically here living with us, with humans, and something happened. Now, sometimes it depends on the tradition. Sometimes it's a battle between humans and these creatures. Sometimes it's something else that happens, but there's consistently this idea that they left or they were banished. Now, when they leave, they often, they depart through a hole in the earth or a shimmering doorway or something. And, we're talking about a portal. Some of this stuff, if you strip it down and you just listen to the folk tales, even 20 years ago, you could tell these things. And most people, even researchers in the field, would say, yeah, but that's just mythology. That's just myth. Well, wait a minute. We have to go back and respect these early stories and understand them, whether it's coming from the lips of a native elder or whether it's coming from a book of the Bible. We have to understand that, this stuff is not all just fabricated out of, thin air just to entertain someone at the time.
Yeah, it has to come from somewhere.
It came from some sources. It's documented for a very particular reason. And I find that a lot of native traditions, and I use that term broadly, not just in the Americas, but also in Europe and other regions of the world, usually distinguish very clearly between talking about something that is a spirit and is in spirit form, and something that they're saying is real and tangible and is something that humans interact with or did interact with. And I think I've always tried to pay a lot of attention to that. When I started in this field, there weren't any television shows on talking about ghosts or UFOs or any of this stuff. That In Search Of came along in the 70s, but other than that, I mean, this stuff it just this is the era of PG, pre-Google. You couldn't you couldn't pull up a screen and Google, what's a tulpa. So, I really buried myself in books and read extensively, be it religion or shamanism or the paranormal, the supernatural, all the mythologies and all these different things. And I think that, for me, that's been an important grounding and aspect of how I've proceeded into the field, with an understanding that I personally think that it's important to look at the traditions, the folklore, the beliefs of the region that you're investigating, because there are going to be clues there. that traditional lore is going to tell you something. If they're talking about pixies, there's a reason for it. And you really delve in below the surface and begin to understand that we're talking about a rich tradition that goes back way, way back, to the oral traditions of the people there. And there is some kind of connection to contemporary manifestations. I really believe that. So, having that foundation in the history and having that knowledge can help us understand and give us a different perspective for what's happening today. And it's pretty fascinating to me that in modern times, the past 10 or 15 years, some of these things that I was talking about a long time ago and other people were talking about at the time were seen as silly, but now quantum scientists are saying, oh yeah, well, there's 13 other levels of existence. We don't know what's there or how to get there, but we know they're there. Well, duh. Yeah. Traditions around the world have been talking about this for ages. This is where these other beings went. They left and they went to some other dimension. The same thing is true. You're talking about these weird stories of hybrids. Go out and start telling somebody about a satyr, a goat man or something like that. And they'll look at you like you're nuts. Meanwhile, in another county somewhere, some scientist is creating a goat that can spin spider webs.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, what is that? It's genetic manipulation. And, once again, we have to consider, okay, well, the traditional lore says this, why were they saying this? How do these things happen? So, yeah, completely possible that some kind of weird early genetic manipulation was going on that accounts for some of these ancient stories, be they biblical or folkloric or whatnot.